Could an interim Chief People Officer role, also, of course, known as an interim Chief Human Resources Officer role, be your perfect career option for now or in the future? In this episode of HR Coffee Time, we're exploring what life in that role is like instead of being in a permanent job. The skills you need, along with the challenges and rewards, so that you can decide if it's the right step for you, whether that's going to be now or in the future. And if we haven't met before, hello and welcome. It's wonderful to have you listening today or watching on YouTube if you're watching on there. If you have tuned in before, thank you for coming back, and I hope you're going to really enjoy today's episode. I'm Faye Wallace, a career and executive coach specialising in supporting HR and people professionals to thrive at work. And before we dive into the main part of the episode, I want to make sure that I say a big thank you to Nikki Hale, who shared a wonderful post on LinkedIn recommending HR Coffee Time. And she mentioned how inspiring she found episode 149 with the amazing Chief People Officer, Fumi Onamusi. Nikki, your kind words really meant a lot. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you helping spread the word about the show. Thank you so much. This episode is part of a special HR Coffee Time series where we take a deep dive into the CPO or CHRO role, asking each Chief People Officer guest the same 9 questions that were chosen by you, the HR Coffee Time listeners. And Dotty Day, who you're about to meet, is the 6th CPO we'll have been lucky enough to learn from so far. Dotty is an experienced interim HR leader, strategy consultant, and excitingly, she's also a business community founder. She has New Leaf, her consultancy that supports ambitious businesses with HR leadership, and she's also the founder of Gighrly, which is a thriving business club for HR freelancers and consultants, which she's created to help people professionals prosper in business. It is definitely worth checking out if you haven't come across it before, and I'll make sure that I put a link to it in the show notes for you and in the YouTube description for this episode if you'd like to learn more about it. In the interview with Dotty, you're about to hear her share her journey to becoming an interim CPO, and it wasn't really a conventional journey, so I think that it makes things even more interesting. She also talks about what the role is like, how she's navigated the pressures of the role, and she has loads of amazing advice for anyone who's considering becoming a Chief People Officer or becoming an interim Chief People Officer. I hope you're going to enjoy learning from Dotty as much as I did. Let's go ahead and meet her now. Welcome to the show, Dotty. It is so wonderful to have you here with us today.
Oh, thank you, Faye. It's an absolute pleasure and really looking forward to talking about my career with you.
Oh, that is brilliant to hear. And I'm going to start us off with the very first question, which is, how did you get your first Chief People Officer role?
Oh, my word. So my career has been long and windy, I think it's fair to say, a bit like the yellow brick road. So it's certainly not been a linear career that many people aspire to or see as a textbook approach to getting your first sort of exec kind of level role. So the first half of my sort of 20 plus year career was in generalist roles, spent sort of 10 years climbing the corporate ladder, getting to the heady heights of becoming a functional head within the resourcing, now talent acquisition space, leading a team of 32 people, multi-million pound budget, and definitely on a trajectory, but not a trajectory to being a Chief People Officer. It was a trajectory, I can't even say the word, trajectory to burnout. And my last kind of foray into kind of being a head of function, I got ill. I really got ill. It was a real wake-up moment for me that made me really question why I was doing what I was doing and who for, ultimately. And decided at that point that I needed to take control. It's something that I tell a lot of people when they're in a similar position, to take control. And what I did and what that meant for me was I took time out. I left corporate life, had a little bit of saving, and I just took some breathing space. And that breathing space constituted me painting pictures in my back bedroom, made to order, set up an online business. I traded through eBay. I had lots of orders, pictures that I basically painted, which was just the breathing space I needed, but was very lonely and really fundamentally made me crave going back into a team environment and being able to talk to people all day. So that was my first sort of stop moment. I took a step backwards when I went back into corporate life because I felt that I still needed that breathing space. But within 2 years, I was back in a head of function role within the resourcing space at another company. So it wasn't really until I had my daughter that my life completely changed again. And when she was about 18 months, I made the decision for various reasons to go solo, to leave corporate life again. The main reason was that I wanted more flexibility. It wasn't something that was afforded me in my corporate sort of employed positions. And actually having a child made it all the more challenging to remain operating at a senior level with all the expectations that were presented. And I was really worried about burnout and getting to a point where, much like the previous time, I was crying in the car park. So I just thought, do you know what? I'm just going to take control again. Didn't know what that looked like. Spent 6 months working my notice, I'll figure it out. And what figuring it out meant was going solo, working through my own business. Initially, co-founded a recruitment business with a former supplier, and I did that for about 2 years. Another story, but essentially that partnership dissolved. And at that point, I decided to go interim. And looking at all of the things that I'd done in my previous roles, what I enjoyed the most was transformation, was structuring and doing things differently. So essentially, I began a career as being a change manager, organization designer, and essentially helping businesses to transform. And really, it was through that experience over the last 15 years that within the last 5 got me an offer of a chief people officer remit. So throughout that prior time, I was working as part of multidisciplinary program teams, basically being the people change lead and arguably being the right hand to the chief people officer and to the board. I was brought into many board meetings to talk about the transformation agenda from a people perspective. So that gave me insight into the thinking patterns, the questions that board members quite often pose at you, which frankly are all highly commercial, less feeling and caring about the people agenda, if I'm honest. But it certainly gave me a real insight into how boards discuss certain sort of topics, and particularly from a people agenda, how I needed to be in order to be deemed to be credible in that forum. So that was all stepping stone experience to helping me get to a point where I became a people and change director. I was offered a role from within, if you like, heading it all up, transforming organizations from within, which then led to somebody having previously worked with me in that context, asking me if I would be the chief people officer for a new entity that was transforming from a service business to a SaaS business. So essentially a product-led IT business. And I just thought, oh, okay, this is something that I think I can do. I hope I can do. And I certainly would like to do. So that is how I got my chief people officer remit, but it was still an interim sort of on an interim basis. And it had a very big emphasis on transformation. So
wow, it's so interesting to hear your story, Dotty. I didn't know all of that, but I'm really sorry to hear that your whole journey towards becoming a chief people officer actually stems from that horrible period of burnout. That sounds like it was incredibly tough.
It was, and I would not recommend it for anybody. My body gave up on me. My head was going to explode every single day that I drove to the car park. And the pressure was just too immense. And most of that I was putting on myself, to be honest. So that desire to perform, that desire to be the best. I was in my early 30s at that point, and it just took its toll. So, yeah, I needed to reset for sure.
It's awful to hear that you had to go through that, but I'm really grateful to you for being so honest and talking about it, because I know that it's going to help at least one person, if not many, many people who may be teetering on that point or who are pushing themselves too hard at work, and to know that they're not alone. This does happen and there are ways through it as well. And in fact, with you talking about it, it makes me think I'm going to skip right ahead to one of the other questions instead of asking them in order, because of course, being a chief people officer can be a very highly pressured role. So
Yes.
can I ask you how you maintain your mental well-being when you're in such a high priority and demanding role? And I guess I'm asking that especially given the fact that you have experienced burnout before.
Yeah. So it's been an evolutionary process, really. I didn't suddenly have an epiphany and think, oh, I'm going to look after myself. I'm going to go and do yoga and all of the meditation that is freely available now. Breath work wasn't a thing in those days. So I think that certainly over a period of time, I learned my trigger points were. I learned that there were certain times where I knew I was getting to a point of extreme stress, and I took myself away from that through exercise, through going for lunch with friends, and just being able to take myself away from those situations. So in the most basic of terms, that is how I developed the coping strategy. Since then, obviously, I've become much more at ease with being able to say no and saying no confidently. Whereas I spent most of my early career saying yes. And in many respects, saying yes has given me the opportunities that I'm very grateful for having. But in having that mentality, I didn't have any boundaries. So I think that certainly over the latter half of my career, particularly as an interim, what that's enabled me to do is set those boundaries, be really clear about taking on too much, and also having the ability to be able to be really quite structured in my response to being asked to take more on. So I tend to adopt a pragmatic program manager sort of stance of it's about time, it's about cost, and it's about quality. So if you want me to do 10 things instead of the 3 that you'd asked me to do, then either it's going to take longer, or I'm going to have to do a lesser job, or you're going to need to invest in some additional resources for me to be able to deliver this in the time that you need. So either way, there has got to be some compromise. And I found that approach has been a total lifesaver for me in the work context. Of course, privately, I've found breath work to be immensely calming for me. I didn't really know what I was doing in the early days, but I've developed that, and I'm able to exploit that in situations where I'm feeling a bit anxious. But by and large, it's about maintaining a bit of objectivity around my working style and having the ability now to calmly say no, but to be able to say it in an objective way. And I think that's really a key learning that I've honed over the last 10 years specifically, and certainly over the last 5 as my agenda's gotten even more burgeoning.
And what helped you to get to that point where you realised, okay, this is how I can confidently say no?
I sought a coach, and quite often you kind of think, I'm the one who's been formally coaching lots of other people. Who's helping me out here? So it took me a long time to do that, but I sought out a coach, and she was absolutely fabulous. She unpacked, or helped me to unpack, a lot of things that basically were triggering, were stress events in my life that I, in reviewing them, could have done differently in terms of my coping mechanism, and really holding me to account in terms of how I dealt with situations, and in a way helping me to diffuse those and not make them so big that actually the anxiety builds up to such a degree that it takes its toll on my health. So having somebody who understood my ambition, which, was to reach the heights I want to be a CEO. That was ultimately what I wanted. And fundamentally helping me to see that I am enough and that I am more to others by being healthy. And so that was my savior. And actually investing in that was quite some investment, but it's the best investment I've ever made.
Oh, I'm so pleased to hear you had such a positive experience of coaching and that it was so helpful. I think that when you hear of a great solution, which you've described, which is the being very pragmatic and explaining why you're saying no to something, but you're in the headspace of having always said yes your whole life, it doesn't matter if you hear the advice or you read it in a book or something. It can feel so incredibly hard to go from, but I say yes to everything, to then being able to actually say to someone, no. And I do think, obviously, I'm completely biased because I am a coach, but I do think that is where coaching can be so helpful, because it can help you, edge you to address that and make that move with confidence and in your own time and in your own way.
Yep.
So it's great to hear that. For everyone who is listening or watching right now, I had no idea what any of Dotty's answers are going to be to these questions. So I'm learning alongside you, and it's fabulous to hear them. So I better move us along to our next question now. I'm going to skip all the way back to the beginning. And this next question is, for you, what has been the biggest difference between being a head of HR or HR director and then being a chief people officer? Although as I'm saying that, actually, I'm trying to think, what was the job title you had before you became CPO?
So I was a people and change director prior to
Yes,
becoming.
okay, perfect. Oh, good. Okay, so this question does make sense then. So what was the difference between having that job title and then becoming a chief people officer?
Okay. This is where sometimes titles can absolutely be misleading, because as a people and change director, I chose that title, by the way. I did not want to be called a chief people officer because nobody else in that business was called a chief of anything. However, the role that I took on was much broader. So if I compare the role, not the title, but the role, with a role that I previously did as a head of, essentially, the difference was I was the strategy maker. I was the person who would not only set the people agenda, but influence the business agenda on a much broader basis. As a head of, or I would envisage as a HR director in a divisional context, I implemented the corporate strategy. I contributed to the people agenda, but I wasn't accountable for all of it. And so suddenly moving to a chief people officer remit exposed me so much more in that strategic realm, in that commercial realm, in that questioning our marketing strategy, our proposition development, our operating model, and whether actually we should be targeting the US when we haven't actually quite nailed Europe, and looking at the cost benefit of a market entry strategy. These were all strategic interventions that prior to that, my focus was on the people agenda and the delivery of it alone. So whilst I was very interested in the wider business and the nuts and the bolts, my role didn't necessitate my involvement in that. And so actually the move to being a chief people officer, howsoever called, was much broader. And therefore my, I say, sphere of influence was much more business orientated than purely people agenda orientated. And that was the biggest difference I certainly experienced in the transition.
Oh my goodness, that's going to be so interesting for everyone listening. And for me, that was really interesting for me, Dotty, because obviously I'm not telling anyone what to say. I don't say to anyone beforehand, oh, it'd be great if you could mention this or that. But I've been sort of hoping that at some point someone may touch on the fact that in some organizations, the title people director or HR director is the same as chief people officer in another organization, because I know that can be a bit confusing for some people, especially if you're in an organization where there isn't anyone who has the title chief in front of their job role, then it's very unlikely that CPO role is going to exist. So to then have you explain, well, if that's the case, then what is this key difference between being a head of or being an HR director when there is a chief people officer in the organization, I think is just so incredibly helpful for people to hear. And the question that sprung to my mind immediately that I know some people will be thinking is, oh my gosh, that feels a bit terrifying and like quite a big leap. So how do you develop that commercial acumen? How can you get comfortable with the fact that you are going to be helping shape the strategy for the whole organization rather than the people side of it?
Well, it's a bit of learning, but also it's having the will to do it, I think is really key. Because we all talk about HR wanting to be more commercial. What does that actually mean? That means getting curious about the business. That means asking those silly questions that you might feel awkward to ask. It's about understanding how a business or an organization makes their money and loses their money. And therefore, everything that's in there is about how it operates as a business. The crux of most businesses to this day still is operating costs are predominantly people-based. Yes, there's systems, yes, there's processes, yes, there's suppliers, etc. But predominantly an operating cost tends to be the headcount. And so actually, as a people professional wanting to move into that space, asking those curious questions is a must. It really is, because it helps you to identify the business problems that you can then start to think about, okay, what kind of strategy could we build on this problem with? And how can we truly solve today's problem, but also anticipate tomorrow's problems as well? And it's the curiosity, I think, that is absolutely the bedrock to being able to develop that commercial acumen. I spent years working with finance people who, frankly, initially hated my guts because I'm an overhead from the center, essentially. That's kind of my introduction. But actually spending time with your finance contact, asking those questions about, okay, so how do we manage our accounts? How do we cost things out? What are our key performance indicators as a business? And therefore, how could I then influence those? And what metrics might I need to be able to measure in order to influence those metrics? And quite often they're financial metrics, if I'm perfectly honest with you. So getting to understand that. The second piece was also getting really close to marketing and brand, because essentially I see marketing and brand as the flip side of the coin that is culture. And so fundamentally, understanding the brand strategy and the marketing approach to then be able to translate that into a people and culture strategy was my next aim, really. So again, marketing was one of those functions where I always veer towards to say, help me understand what's our brand purpose? Have we got one? Is it clear? Do we understand why we exist, who for, and what our mission is? And of course, if the answer is yes, great, give it all to me. And let's see how that translates into our ways of working. If it isn't, then how can we collaborate to get us to a point where we're all really super clear on what that is? And in my interim roles, I've been very fortunate to work cross-functionally on transformation programs that included lots of different functions and contributions. So it enabled me to start having those kind of conversations, even when I wasn't at chief people officer level, start joining those dots. So you don't have to be a chief people officer in order to get curious about a business. And I would definitely recommend that any aspiring chief people officer gets curious as early as possible in their career. I remember back in 1997, oh my goodness, that was a long time ago. I was in my very early career. I was working with a brand new credit card company to the UK. I was part of the setup team. It was very exciting. But I remember getting feedback from a manager whose name I will not mention. And he kept saying, why do you keep asking me? Why do you keep asking me why we're doing something in a certain way? And because I wanted to understand the purpose of everything that we were doing in the HR team. Not for any other reason, but just to understand. And that apparently irked this person. And I'm thinking, don't be that manager who gets frustrated by your people asking you why. Help them to understand that. And if you don't understand why, get curious yourself, because that's the only way we're going to make a difference as a profession to any business, by solving those business problems, asking why, and being really purposeful about what we do. and not just doing things because it's a good thing and we think it's great and it's the next big thing around the corner or whatever because we think it's good. Actually, it's not always the case that your CEO is going to think the same. So building that curiosity to understand the business is number one step. Of course, then looking at additional learning opportunities. I went on marketing courses. I went on business purchasing courses. I went on mini leadership courses as well, but not leadership in the sense of how to lead people, but more how to lead a business. So business strategy, and started to get a sense of the bigger picture as opposed to the pure HR qualification that exists, as we know, through the CREPD. So that, for me, is a route that's led to my kind of path being sort of towards that chief people officer piece. But I see it in so many people that curiosity is what gets them there. It really does. So I would definitely recommend that approach.
Oh, I've definitely seen a theme from all the interviews that we've had so far about the chief people officer role and this need to really broaden out your knowledge outside of the technical HR expertise. And from you mentioning those courses, I'm going to skip us ahead again to one of the other questions, which is, are there any courses or qualifications you've taken that were particularly useful for succeeding as a CPO? Because I strongly suspect a lot of the ones you just mentioned would have been.
Well, yes, but I suppose a lot of my learning has been on the job. So yes, I've mentioned those courses, and I would always sort of suggest that you augment your learning with some sort of academic study of some description. But they were short courses for me because my attention span is probably quite limited. An MBA is an obvious one to go for if you want to get to C-suite. But that wasn't the route I took. I just thought that I need to understand it, but I don't necessarily feel the need for the stripes that an MBA kind of gives you. That said, the learning that I got on the job was spending time with our commercial team, spending time shadowing our sales function to understand how they go about developing the pipeline, how they go about generating leads in the first place, which was a marketing activity, and how the two are quite often frustrated and quite often are, again, two sides of a coin, but not always joined up. Most of my learning has been through that means as opposed to through a qualification. I got my CIPD in 1997, so it's been quite some time since I qualified as a chartered member, but I've never really felt the need to get the qualification. It's more the learning that drives me. So I'm not sure how helpful that is for your audience.
I think it's very helpful because it's really reassuring that a lot of this stuff you can learn just by being curious, as you were just saying, and making sure that you try and go to other departments and functions and people and learn everything. For anyone who hasn't listened before, there are these 9 set questions that I ask every single guest. So moving on to the next question, once you'd started your first CPO role, how was it different to what you had expected?
Oh my, I'm never sure I know what to expect from any role that I've ever taken on. I think that it was something that I felt I could do possibly, but there was a sea of unknowns that were also prevalent. So, I'm here now. What do I do? And actually, expectations were, I'm here to build the people strategy. That's my expectation. In reality, I found myself in the thick of commercial decisions, crisis management, sort of looking at sales pitches, tenders, trying to answer PR questions around social value that I had literally not genned up on enough, quite frankly. Certainly investor conversations threw me as well. So whilst I mentioned I'd previously been in board meeting on specific transformation agenda topic, I hadn't really anticipated the cutthroat nature of being in an investor-led board meeting where there was absolutely no room for fluff at all. Their sentence, not mine, and almost being seen as the fluffy one in the room just by virtue of the job title that I had. So that was an eye-opener, and I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting to be able to think, okay, I've earned my seat here, therefore my voice is also to be heard. What I wasn't expecting was that it's just as hard at board to be heard as it is at any time throughout my career. And actually, it was down to me not to be feeling entitled to it anymore, but actually to prove myself that I'm a worthy contributor to the dialogue. And whilst it irked me no end when the topics that were discussed, I had a thought about, and my thoughts were perhaps dismissed quite quickly, whereas 2 weeks later, the same thought would be provided by the chief revenue officer, and it was the best thing since sliced bread. So I had to learn very quickly that my seat still had to be earned, even though I was at the table. And actually, the perception, sadly, of the contribution of HR to a business strategy and business success is still seen as secondary to the contributions of sales, marketing, and finance and IT. So I had to change my approach and become much more manipulatively influential. So working through each of the C-suite individually to essentially lobby my causes and to get them to become my allies in the actual meeting. And in doing so, over time, my voice started to get listened to because I had more people around the table nodding in violent agreement when I said something. And actually, at that point, the chief exec, the chair, had actually started to go, okay, well, we'll give this a go. We'll pilot your idea. And so fundamentally, what could have been really kind of career diminishing, I thought, okay, I need to work at this. Why should I? Everyone else has that all automatically. And so that is the challenge that we have as the people professional in the room. And I think that for all of the curiosity, for all of the commercial thinking, we still have a job to do to convince traditionalists in particular about the value, the true value that we can bring. And I suppose that's how it was different, because up until that point, I was there to talk about specific focus, which was transformation orientated, not about the whole picture. And yet I felt I had as much to say as everybody else around that table, but nobody was listening at first. So that was a shock.
So many great insights from that answer. And it really builds on or confirms some of the advice that we've had before on the show, especially when it comes to the meetings before the meeting, like the fact that you can't just walk into a board meeting and think, I have a brilliant idea or I have a great insight. Everyone will listen and agree. Actually, it does take time, and you do have to have spoken to everyone individually a lot of the time about the idea before you get the buy-in. So it's great to hear that again, Dotty. And you have touched on many of the things that I'm about to ask you about here. So the next question is, which skills, habits, or practices have most helped you succeed as a CPO? Now, I know you've talked about curiosity a lot. You've just talked about influencing, but I am sure there are some other things in the mix that you feel have really helped, and it would be brilliant to hear about them.
Yeah. Well, I won't dwell on the curiosity. I can't even say it now. But actually, listening more than talking. So really listening. Ask the question, but really listen to the answer. That is a skill I've honed over many years. It's too tempting to ask the question, hear an answer, and then jump in with your own knowledge, affirmations. And actually, just by listening and listening with intent, I think that's a skill that we can all hone, because you might miss a trick if you're busy thinking about the next thing you're going to say. And I think that certainly it's a skill I've honed over many years, because human tendency is to want to agree very quickly and violently with a topic, or disagree equally as quickly with a topic if indeed you've got something that burning that you want to say. But it is just taking the time to listen before you respond, because then your response is rational and considered. and calm, and it's not then a reaction. And so fundamentally, you will then glean far more information. You will also have more influence because you can then relate back to something that somebody's already said. And I would definitely urge people to, who are listening here, to practice that as a skill, acknowledge that as a key skill as well. So that's combined with the curiosity to ask the question in the first place. The other sort of skill, great quality, is to think about the language that you use as a HR professional. It's all too easy to go jargonistic. I had a former client who said, "What the hell's talent acquisition?" "Oh, you mean recruiting good people?" Just say that then. So sometimes we can get a little bit into our own labels with some of the language that we use, and actually bringing that back to relevant context. And by that, I mean, some businesses are quite sophisticated and are probably already utilizing certain language that is quite prevalent in HR circles. But in many businesses, and I would predominantly state that in small to medium sector specifically, calling something kind of fancy doesn't actually make it more credible. And I think that was a key learning for me. Use the language of the business to get your point across. And then adapt. So you might have a plan and you might want it looks brilliant. You've got your shiny PowerPoint, you've got your 3 pillars, you've got your kind of enabling stuff underneath, and you've got your roadmap. And I can pretty much guarantee you'll achieve maybe 30% of it in the time frame that you're insisting on delivering it all, because things come at you left, right, and center, top, bottom, you name it. And therefore being able to adapt your plans, adapt your thinking to the needs of the business at any point in time is really, really critical. Being prissy about your plan is not going to get you favors with your fellow exec or your CEO or indeed the board, because actually businesses do change their course. Macro events happen. That means a different response. A great example was when one of the businesses I worked with as an interim had a massive cash flow crisis. So their business model basically collapsed overnight through some strategic decisions that were taken for my time, I have to say, but nonetheless had a follow-on impact. And actually, for all of the will of everybody to create this great place to be, actually, we needed to just decide day to day who we were going to pay. So it was everything needs to go on hold and we just need to adapt and muck in. And I think that having that ability to do so is absolutely key at most levels, I would say, but particularly at an exec level, and not to be, as I say, prissy about your plan. So that would be another skill. And then the last thing, because I think it was practices as well as skills, the last thing is to build in thinking time. So as a chief people officer, you should spend a disproportionate amount of your time thinking rather than doing. Quite often you'll have a team of people who will do things for you. So if you're the sort of person who can't let go, who has to do everything, then it will impact your productivity and your performance as a chief people officer. My tip for anybody is to block out thinking time very deliberately. Not force yourself to think, but actually start using that time wisely for reflection, contemplation, research, talking to people, doing your discovery, going back to the floor, whatever it is that helps you to think about your next move. Build that in, because it's far too tempting to go massively into firefighting mode, back into operational thinking, back into supervision, back into even doing the do and going into every single employee relations case because you just want a hand in everything. You have to learn to step back. And in order to do that, you need to build in your thinking time. So that would be my last tip. People listening.
They are all fabulous tips. And the thinking time, again, makes me think of coaching, actually. That often that's the feedback that I'll have about coaching, that it was just so helpful to have a dedicated hour to be able to think things through. And it's one of the reasons with my leadership program, Inspiring HR Leadership, there is a lot of time within the sessions that people can reflect and think and then talk together about the challenges they're experiencing within their organisation or within their roles. So interesting to hear all of those. Thank you for sharing them, Dotty.
Welcome.
Right, let me see where we're up to. What's the next question?
Yes.
Yes. So this one is, what is the biggest challenge you've experienced as a Chief People Officer?
Oh, goodness. Well, I kind of mentioned about the voice and essentially not feeling heard from the get-go. So I won't dwell on that, but I will talk about how lonely it can feel. So as a Chief People Officer, you are the support for your CEO, for your fellow C-suite. At times, you're also support for a non-exec as well. And you take on all of their emotional burdens yourself. And you quickly find that, well, who's going to be that person for me? And how can I share the load with somebody? And so the loneliness of the role is something that I found as a really big challenge. And actually, I've always felt I'm quite well networked, but perhaps those networks, I didn't feel comfortable to share vulnerability within. And so for me, being the person that everybody sought for direction, for support, for guidance, and not having that for myself was a challenge, I think. So I very quickly took control, got a coach, and also found a community of people who I was able to speak more freely within, and just sort out, when I say community, I mean people doing my role who got it. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a formal community, but it was just people in my network that I know I could speak to. So that's what I found personally the biggest challenge, expected to be all things to everybody, and being the conscience, the moral compass, the conscience of the organization, and the weight that you then feel on your shoulders, that personal responsibility, is quite burdensome. So coupled with a bit being lonely, they always say the chief exec is the loneliest position, but with a great CPO by their side, I think that's not the case. But then who's the chief people officer's right hand? And actually what I found in my interim career is that I've often been that person for a chief people officer, and been there sort of a sounding board, that offloading sort of vehicle. I call myself a support vehicle quite often for people in that position, because they feel they haven't got anybody else to go to. So that's been the biggest challenge, I would say, the feeling of loneliness.
I think it's something that people just do not realise at all. And that counts for everybody within an organisation, that if they're going to start criticising the senior leadership team or the CPO in particular, they just think that you know everything and are fine. And
We're fair game.
Yeah. But actually it can be incredibly tough. So it's great to hear that you found that community for yourself, and that you're able to encourage everyone listening. If you are a chief people officer, or you're heading there, or you're feeling lonely in your role, that there are things that you can do to counteract that as well. So thank you, Dotty. As always, I'm going to end up saying thank you about 100 times. I so appreciate you sharing all of this advice. It's wonderful. Now, we have got 2 questions left to get through, and we're about to run out of time. So we're going to have to be super quick with these ones. So what advice do you have for anyone listening who would like to be a CPO one day?
I would say don't get hung up on the job title, because I think that, the route to it is as much about your thinking style as it is about the titles that you assume. And I think that if you think there's a perfect CV out there that you need to have, well, there isn't. I think that's the key kind of piece of advice that I would give. Don't get hung up on the job title, and don't think you've got to have the perfect trajectory in order to be considered. I was an incessant job hopper in my early career. It precluded me from lots of roles, because people with traditional views felt that I wouldn't be committed to them, but I still found a path. So all is not lost for anybody, and don't get hung up on that perfect CV.
Well, that's great to hear. And also it makes me think right back to the beginning of the interview when you talked about how you got your first interim CPO role. There could be people listening right now thinking, oh, I'm an interim, I'm not an interim CPO, so I can never do that. Or, oh, I'm never going to get to that level because I haven't done the job yet. So I think it's great that it can give lots of people hope and reassurance that you haven't got to have become a CPO in-house somewhere before making the leap to being a CPO as an interim as well. So I think that ties in quite nicely with that advice. And then my final official question is, what is the one piece of advice you would give to anyone who is about to start their first CPO role and is nervous about it?
Well, firstly, I'd say congratulations to them, but I'd also add that they need to remember they were chosen to do this role. So there's clearly qualities already that they've displayed that have made them very worthy of the job. Okay. Secondly, you don't have to have all the answers from day one. Use your first 90 days as a discovery process so that you can take your time before you feel compelled to have to solve a problem. Actually get deeper into the organization, because that is gold for you. And in doing that, you can ask all of those curious questions. You can get to know the business, but you're in control of that. So definitely take that control and say, look, I'm on a discovery, I'm on 90 days. I'm going to be looking at these parts of the business. I want to meet with lots and lots of people from all levels. And I really want to immerse myself in this organization before I start building out any kind of people strategy. A, it buys you time, thinking space, head space, but B, it really does enable you to address the true business problems and create a people strategy that's really compelling as a consequence of your discovery. So I'm definitely recommending that. And it will also give you confidence to be able to present some really compelling recommendations as to how you move that people strategy forward. So that would be my two.
Fabulous, reassuring advice. And I now feel like I told you a lie because I said that was the final question. But actually, there's one more question that isn't in the list of 9 that I feel I have to ask you super quickly, which is that for anyone listening who would like to be an interim, they've decided it is the path for them. First of all, if you're listening and that is you, I have got a whole episode about this, about getting an interim role and whether actually being interim is right for you. And so I will let you know in the outro. So when Dotty disappears in a minute, you will then see another recorded section by me or hear another recorded section by me. I'll tell you what the title is and what the number is. I'm so sorry, I can't remember it off the top of my head. But just as I have you here, Dotty, what is your advice for anyone who would like to get their first interim position? How can they go about doing that?
Okay. I think it's about being intentional more than anything else. I think that people consider maybe interim if they can't find another permanent role. And that's okay as a strategy, but the emphasis on delivering quickly, getting to the nub of the problem as quickly as you possibly can, not having a clear brief, not having a job description that you can start to go, okay, how am I doing against this? And almost feeling your way is part of the course. You have to be that adaptability that I mentioned, that goes all and also for being an interim. So if somebody is seriously considering becoming an interim with some intent, then absolutely hone in on adaptability, versatility, quick delivery, being able to address business problems swiftly, and really showcasing that in their career to date. You don't have the luxury of a massive induction program. I mentioned the 90 days. Obviously, as an interim chief people officer, you usually are there for about a year or more. But if you're an interim in any other respect, then you don't always have the luxury of an in-depth induction. You've got to find those people yourself. You've got to then absolutely take accountability for arranging your own meeting, and finding out everything on your own terms. Nothing will get laid on for you. So it can be quite a culture shock when you move from permanent kind of roles to an interim space. You just have to get on with it. And if you are minded in that kind of way, that you're very delivery orientated and you're quite self-starting, you will thrive. If you're expecting things to be laid on for you, then I think there's probably a little bit more discussion you might want to have with existing interims to really get comfortable with the prospect.
Oh, I'm so pleased I asked you that, Dotty. What brilliant advice to finish on. So all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you for your time today. It has just been utterly amazing getting to spend the time with you. And I know so many people listening will really appreciate it too. Well, everyone listening will really appreciate it too.
Thank you. Yes, I hope so. It's been a pleasure.
I'd love to know what stood out for you from this conversation with Dotty. It's always wonderful to hear from you and to get your feedback. You can let me know in the YouTube comments or send me a message on LinkedIn. Or if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even post about the episode on LinkedIn and tag me in. That would be amazing. It's always incredible to see anyone's post pop up on there. For me, a few things really stood out. I loved Dotty's advice to be intentional about developing commercial acumen. That is a message that has just come through so loud and clear from all of the interviews that we've had with the chief people officers so far. So definitely something to be paying attention to. But I also loved her tips on saying no to avoid taking on too much and risking burnout. Another thing I thought was great was her suggestion of talking to people individually about your idea before then bringing it into the boardroom to increase your chances of getting buy-in for it. Such a helpful strategy that can really work. And if saying no is something you find hard yourself and you're at risk of working too hard and doing too much, then I have a couple of other episodes that you might like to listen to next. There's episode 7, What to Do When You Don't Have Enough Hours in the Day, and episode 123, Avoid Burnout, How to Spot Signs of Stress and Take Action. If you can relate to Dotty's story about putting an idea forward and it being ignored, I know I can relate to that, only for someone else to suggest the same thing later and get all the credit, then you might also find episode 86 helpful, which is how to stop other people taking credit for your ideas in meetings. Then a very final episode to recommend is if you want to explore interim work even further, then have a listen to episode 103. Career Options in HR, is contracting the perfect fit for you? I'll put the links to all of those episodes in the show notes for you. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate and review the show in your podcast app, or share it with a friend, or subscribe on YouTube if you've just found it on YouTube. It really helps more people to find HR Coffee Time, and it's just fantastic to have your support. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode where you get to meet another amazing and inspiring Chief People Officer.